I'll get down to it. I really sincerely appreciate you coming on. I've been following your work very closely, and I'm sure a lot of people have kind of caught on to your work during the pandemic, and that's how you first caught my attention. And I've since gone down the rabbit hole with your work, and I'm just about to wrap up the book on vaccines. I've read your book on the heart, which argues the heart is not a pump, and I've read your book on cancer. And for me personally, it was good, sort of fortuitous timing to find you, because I think at any other point in my life, I would have probably rejected most of what you say and written it off as quackery or something. And through just I guess, fortuitous series of events, I've stumbled onto the work of Gerald Pollack and a lot of other folks that I think we sort of have in common and that have likely influenced your work. And I think the stars aligned, and I found your work when I was supposed to, because it really has resonated with me. And the one thing I'll say is that there's almost no one that I know in my life that agrees with me, and I'm sure you're used to that phenomenon. And it's been a little frustrating, and I've kind of learned to just keep my mouth shut and pick my moments. But if you say to someone that there really may not be such a thing as a contagious virus, or the heart is not a pump, people don't want to hear that stuff, and they're not even open to having a discussion about it. So I guess my first question for you is, how do you deal with that? Just the constant frustration of knowing that you're looking at the world a completely different way than 99% of the people.
I don't know. I don't really worry about it. It's been like that my whole life, more or less. And I just think what I think for whatever reason I think. And, it changes over time. And I have often said I get a lot of things wrong. Everything, the other part of that is pretty much everything I've ever gotten wrong, or maybe not everything, but close, is because I believe the dominant narrative too much. And a lot of times I would know it at the time, like, I don't think that's right, but I didn't want to take it on at the time. So I just kind of left it. And you would think I would be on the lookout, and I'm a little bit more on the lookout now, but I just, for me, I don't worry about it. I say what I say and let the chips fall where it may. And if I'm wrong, I try to admit it and move on, and that's all you can do.
Yeah, it's more difficult these days when so much is going on with government lockdowns and masks and vaccines, that for me it's very frustrating to believe what I now believe, thanks to you, and know that there's very little hope, at least in the immediate future, of really making an impact on the powers that be. Does that deter you, dissuade you, frustrate you at any point?
I mean, it may be a little different for me, because I have a lot of pretty well-known people, to a certain extent, either asking my opinion or calling me an idiot, or both. Probably not both, same people, but and so I just can't worry about things like that. I mean, people are going to believe what they want to believe. Most of them are, in my opinion, under kind of a spell. The other thing I think is, this may be a little bit relevant to this conversation, this point. You see, in the very first book I wrote, called The Fourfold Path to Healing, one of the co-authors was a good friend of mine named Jamin McMillan. And he came to a very interesting revelation, which is, so there's two ways of looking at why you think or feel the way you do. There's a lot of different ways, but what he was talking about is, if you come upon a person, and, or let me do it like this. So I'm going to show you two people and you tell me which person is happy and which person is depressed. Okay?
Okay.
So here's person number one. Here's person number two.
All right.
Okay?
Number one's happy. Number two's depressed.
Right. Now, here's an interesting thing. You don't know anything about that person. In fact, it's the same person. You've never even heard what that person thinks about life, right? And so how do you know that number one is happy and the two is depressed? And not only that, my guess is, correct me if I'm wrong, but you are 100% sure you got it right. Right?
Pretty much. Yeah.
There's no doubt in your mind. Now, Jamin said to himself, if that's the case, and if you're like this, you can't feel or think any differently than what's emerging out of your body. So there's nothing to tell that person. There's no convincing him or trying to make them feel better. All I'm going to do is rearrange your body somehow so you're like this. And then you will feel differently because the reality is different. Now, the way that applies in this context is I've ended up deciding that when all is said and done, the only thing that we can prove exists in a cell or a tissue, let's say a tissue, is a very thin membrane, organized water, a bunch of stuff like lipids and minerals and amino acids dissolved in the water, mitochondria and nucleus. The rest of the things which we're told are in the cell or in the tissue actually don't exist. They're artifacts of the way we process and kill tissue. And the way it works is this organized water acts like a sort of radio. And that gets into a story. A little 5-year-old friend of mine, I was driving in the car, and then somehow an interview of me came on during we were driving. And he looked at me and he says, "Tom, how did you get in that radio?" And I thought it was a great question. Nobody thinks the sound emerges from the radio, but yet the neurologists and medical doctors think your brain thinks thoughts. And I would submit there's no more evidence for that than there is that the sound emerges from inside the radio. The radio is necessary for sound, but what it's doing is acting as a receiver for sound waves out in the world of a certain sort of frequency, and you have to tune the radio in order to process it into sound or music or something. The same with your brain. And in this case, it's not a transistor, I guess, for the radio, but it's an organized water crystal. And the reason it's a water crystal is because water is a holographic pattern that's also has infinite binding sites. And it basically receives energy and then it changes itself depending on what the input is. And so it's organized out of the proteins and the minerals that essentially gives the structure of the water. Now, if that's true, which it is, and your brain is 80% water in comparison to like your liver, which is 70%. And the reason is because your brain has to, be a better receiver of thoughts and maybe even feelings than your liver. Not that your liver doesn't, but so what's happening with the people you describe is like the people that Jamin is, their water is screwed up, incoherent. And so if you say something like what you just said, that there actually is no evidence of any pathogenic virus ever in history, it doesn't land because their radio is out of tune. Now, you can get mad at them and say, you're an idiot and, what's the matter with you? And it's like trying to shout at your radio you know, that it can't pick up a signal which it's not powerful enough to get.
How much of it is the receiver part of it, and how much of it is the energetic transmission of that particular message? In this case, there's no such thing as a virus.
But
Is
I hear every day that that virus is going to kill us and the variants are going to kill us. And it doesn't do anything to me because my water says that's just not true. And so it doesn't confuse me or affect me or anything. And what I've noticed in my life is the more I work on myself, partially with the eye towards clarifying and making my water more coherent. And I'll even, you know, thank my water and pray to my water and drink structured water and expose myself to trees and plants and the sun. And, you know, it's like a life based on living water as opposed to a computer-based life, which is a system based on quartz, which never changes. It's just fixed. So I don't want to be a quartz-based organism. I want to be a water-based. As you do that, you become resilient or resistant to basically nonsense.
Makes perfect sense. It reminds me of an interview you did that I listened to with a lady who did some artwork with water based on sort of the memory inherent in water. So do you think memories in general that we have are stored in the water somehow, that's in our brain? Is that what a memory is?
Not just in our brain, but in our body. All the memories are, because it's actually pretty well worked out how it happens. Imagine, so it's like making Jell-O. You put water and protein and then nothing happens. And then you heat the solution and that unfolds the proteins. That allows the water to use the protein as, like the oysters use the dock as a nidus for forming a colony of oysters. The water uses the protein and some minerals and maybe some other things as the nidus for forming this coherent state of water. Now, interestingly, the role of ATP is not energy like everybody thinks. It binds with the protein and makes it unfold, because a folded protein can't interact with water.
Does it heat it up? Is that what happens? The
No,
ATP?
it doesn't need to heat it up. It's an electromagnetic or chemical bond that then unfolds the protein. You can't heat it up because we don't have Bunsen burners in our tissues. So the nature had to devise a non-heat method of unfolding protein. With Jell-O, you can heat it, right? It's easier. So, you know, once that happens, you have a system which is open to experience. And like I said, whenever an experience like a memory comes in or a thought, it essentially binds to one of the sites on the water and subtly changes the crystal structure. And that becomes a memory. And it's the same thing, like this is basically the essence of health and disease. Like if this happens in your joint, you know, normally you have these two negatively charged, because all the gels are negatively charged, sacs called bursa lining your joint. And because the negative charges repel, there's a free movement. So there's gels with negative charge, so you have a free moving joint. And then something happens, like you don't have enough collagen proteins, or you get an injury, or something impacts, some toxin gets into your joint, and then it dissolves the water. And you see that now as an effusion, a swelling in your knee. And then the knee can't keep, the charge can't keep the two bones separate. So they start to wear each other away. Next thing you know, you have what's called osteoarthritis. And the doctors, unfortunately, are confused and they think you have a disease, when what you really have is a erosion of the crystalline nature of your water. So if you think like that, it's not an abstract way of being. It tells you that you need to recrystallize, make the water in your joints more coherent, and then you won't have pain and arthritis anymore. And so it's actually very practical.
And what does coherence mean in this context exactly?
So you can imagine a crystal, like quartz crystal, but a little bit more flexible. So we're talking about the bond angles of water. Now, in bulk water or liquid water, there are some bond angles, but it's mainly individual particles of molecules, H2O or D2O, floating around in the water. As it forms into a coherent state, they organize themselves around certain bonds because of the dipole nature of water. And only water does this. This is why water is the vehicle of life. Without water, there's no life. Only water can create this essentially living, flexible crystal, which is based on the bond angles of the molecules in the water and the ability of water to form an electrical dipole. And this has all been worked out, and you can measure the angles, and you can tell the quality of the water by the angles of the hydrogen and oxygen bonds, and there's nothing sort of loosey-goosey about this. It's very clear, just like you can measure the angles in a quartz crystal.
Could you extract the water out of a joint or any part of the body and analyze it, or at least conceivably could you do this and know whether or not the water is coherent and healthy?
So there you get into the problem that Goethe talked about, which is, he said, this is a paraphrase, I'd say, not a quote, the problem with Western science is we decided we wanted to understand frogs, right? And we wanted to help frogs. We want to know what frogs are made of. We want to know what the ecosystem of the frogs were, and everything to do with what makes up a frog, right? So what's the first thing we do? We kill the frog. And
obviously,
I can tell you that, if the goal was to help the frog, it did not help that frog, because now it's dead. Now, over the centuries, in order to do this, we've probably killed millions of frogs, right? Imagine how many rats and hamsters and guinea pigs we've slaughtered. And the problem is, he said, once you kill the frog, there's nothing to learn. Because whatever the organizing principle of the frog is gone, frog's dead. Now, you could probably see something to do with the structure or whatever, but even that is changed once you kill the frog. So the answer to your question is, as soon as you stick a needle in and suck out the fluid, by the time you get to analyze it, the structure of the water will be different than when it was in you. So I would say that's one of the fundamental problems of modern Western science is we make the assumption that that doing laboratory techniques doesn't change whatever we're looking at from what it was in real life. So let me give you another example of this. So I'll ask you a question. Let's say we want to know what your hand is made of and what your hand does, right? That's our goal.
Okay.
Here's how we're going to do it. First, we're going to cut your hand off your body, and then we're going to put it in an enzyme bath to dissolve all this soft tissue. And then we're going to freeze it at a minus 150 degrees centigrade. And then we're going to grind it up in a blender. And then we're going to soak it in heavy metal dyes. And then we're going to put it on a slide and shoot an electron beam at it to evaporate all the water from the tissue. What do you think the chances that we would have a thorough, accurate understanding of your hand?
Pretty much zero.
So that technique, which is how they make electron microscope pictures, is the only way any human being has seen a virus. Now, what do you think the chances are that that thing you see under an electron microscope is the same in form and function to what it is inside a living being?
Very little.
Right. I would say zero. It's mostly an artifact. What you're seeing is stained debris. Now, that's a problem. So what the problem is, we have a science that assumes those things are accurate. So getting back to your question, you suck somebody's fluid out of their knee, you assume that you haven't changed anything. But what you really need to do is find some sort of device that would actually measure the bond angles while it's in your knee. And even then you have to be careful, because you might shoot it with an electron beam or an X-ray, which by itself changes the water, because now you're adding a whole nother input into the water. This sounds maybe irrelevant or abstract, but it's actually fundamental to medicine, because if you can't get an accurate picture of the state of the person, because everything you do, even telling somebody I'm going to take your blood, produces all kinds of hormonal effects which change your blood sugar. So immediately your blood sugar reading is no longer accurate, because it was done under duress, and we know for a fact that, adrenaline changes your blood sugar. So we have a real problem with this. We need a whole different, diagnostic measuring approach, because the current way, the bottom line is, medicine and Western science has made the assumption that we're only made of chemicals which do not change when we interact with them. And that is laughably naive and inaccurate. In fact, modern physicists say that all matter is either a particle and a wave, and the thing that determines which one it is whether you look at it or not. So how, measuring
Right.
something.
Given that, it's a tough thing to master.
Yeah.
I remember, along these lines, at some point you mentioned a doctor and some videos online that you could find who kind of studied this phenomenon. And I want to say he was studying cells under the microscope and maybe how they were sliced and how that affected the appearance. Am I on the right path with that?
Yeah, Harold Hillman.
Harold Hillman.
I tell you, anybody, I'm to the point where if a doctor, scientist, or biologist writes me a question about how biology or medicine or whatever science works, and they haven't read Hillman, I mostly say now, read Hillman for a month and then get back to me. Because you are not in a position to understand biology or science unless you read Hillman. Now, I didn't read Hillman until maybe 4 to 6 months ago. And it was under the suggestion of Stefan Lenka, who said, Tom, you don't understand what you need to understand until you read Hillman. And so I spent a month and probably read 2,000 pages, some of it again and again.
Wow.
Until I could see what this guy was talking about. And it absolutely revolutionizes how you think. I can give you an example. Like, I don't know if you know much biology or cell biology.
Basics.
So you ask any doctor, any cell biologist, what's in a cell? One of the things they say is a ribosome. You've heard of ribosome?
I have.
So a ribosome is important because it's the place where protein is made. And we are made of protein. And it's important for the current, mRNA injections, because the theory is mRNA is translated into protein in the ribosomes. And so the existence and function of the ribosomes was a huge advance in modern cell biology and cell theory and how we understand genetics and the conversion of a gene, which is DNA, into RNA, into protein, right?
Yep.
So this is huge. Now, here's what I didn't know. So Hillman traces back and gives exact references to how ribosomes were discovered and what is known about them in the last, say, 80, 100 years. Now, here's what I didn't know. The only way that any ribosome has been seen is an electron microscope. In other words, all those steps that I just said. That's number one. So already one should be suspicious. Number two, every single picture of an electron microscope ribosome is a perfect circle, right? Like this. Now, that means if it's a two-dimensional circle, it must have been a sphere in real life, right? Otherwise, there's no way that could look like that. Now, so that's the next step. Now, remember that the way that you got this was partly by homogenizing the tissue. In other words, you put it in a blender. Now, here's the question. So an orange is pretty much a perfect sphere as well, right? So you put an orange in a blender, grind it up, and then you have 1,000 pieces of orange. What are the chances that every single piece is a perfect circle?
Very little.
I would say the answer is actually zero.
Zero.
Right? So how is it possible that every ribosome is a perfect circle? It's not. It's an artifact. In fact, he goes on to prove that these are basically heavy metal stained gas bubbles that come from the dying of the tissue, because you took the tissue out and then you froze it and, you know, beamed it and all the rest of it. And so it liberates gas just because that's what happens. And then you stain them, and the membranes around the gas bubbles, the heavy metal impregnates on that, and then you see it, and he proved that. In which case, you can say without any shadow of a doubt that there are no ribosomes.
No such thing as ribosomes.
No such thing. They made that up. Ribosomes, unicorns, Sasquatch, and space aliens. Now, there's about 20 other things that are supposedly in a cell or a tissue that you can more or less do the same thing. And believe me, I simplified, 50 pages into that little thing. And again, for anybody who doubts this, I can tell you, Hillman was willing to debate anybody at any time, and he never lost. And they hated him because he basically told people the entire cell biology genetic research was based on a house of cards. So they didn't like him very much. But
guess not.
Yeah, but so if that's true, then there is no place where RNA is turned into protein. Because again, all there is in a tissue, is, according to Hillman, it's like blocks of Jello. There's not even really a membrane in between. There's, like, you wouldn't say if you had 2 blocks of Jello, there's a cell membrane.
Right.
It's like there's sort of like something there, but and it's a little thicker, because as you get closer to the edge, the layers of water become more packed in. So it turns out, here's another thing in science. So we're told that the central dogma of science: DNA makes RNA makes protein. Well, then we found out that RNA can make DNA with something called reverse transcriptase. Like, that's supposedly retroviruses or RNA viruses.
Right.
So that sort of fell by the wayside, but we still believe that every protein is coded for by the DNA, right? That's fundamental.
Yep.
So then they do the Human Genome Project, and they find between 10 and 20,000 genes. You know how many proteins there are?
How many?
At least 250,000. So if you do the math, you have the question, how do you get 10,000 genes coding for 250,000 proteins? Because there's 240 that are unaccounted for. And they have all kinds of complex theories of the genes are, the base pairs are rearranged. And then you say, well, who's doing the rearranging? Well, we don't know. The intelligence of the cell, like whatever that means. So here's the reality. There are some proteins that are coded for by genes, but the vast majority of them, like 240 out of 250,000, are actually created de novo, meaning new, in the watery cytoplasm using energy from the outside and amino acids that are just found dissolved in the cytoplasm, in the water, creating a protein out of nothing. That's the only conclusion you can come to that's actually reality based. Now, I would say most people, so-called scientists, doctors, hearing that would think this guy is crazy. But the real crazy is how you can make 10,000 codes make 250,000 end products, because the math just doesn't add up.
It is a little nutty. Unbelievable. That is just mind-blowing. Along those lines, in your book about cancer, you talk a lot about where cancer originates. Is it in the nucleus where the genes are versus is it in the water? Is it in the cytoplasm? How much of what we believe as a society in this current, medical paradigm is related to that? I know cancer, we think that it's a genetic disorder, but I imagine that a large percentage of what we diagnose and what we believe is the origin of all kinds of various diseases and maladies originate from the genes. Would you say that the lion's share of the time, the vast majority of the time, it originates in the cytoplasm and in the water versus the genes?
There is no genetic diseases because first of all, the whole idea of the DNA is a misconception, and the origin of, you go back to the system we're talking about, which is organized water with some other stuff, a nucleus that probably has the DNA in it, at least most of it, and a mitochondria, and that's it. And the way it works is this water system is an energy receiver, and it collects the energies, and this could be anything from thoughts and feelings to the sun and the moon and the dog and everything else, or it could be electromagnetic fields, man-made, which are essentially toxic electromagnetic inputs. And then it creates, based on its own wisdom and blueprint, a structure to meet its needs. And even it unfolds or unmasks or creates the actual genetic sequences. Barbara McClintock did a lot of work on showing that the DNA is not a fixed entity. It's much more malleable than we think. And we're continually recreating our entire genome, as we go. And so what's happening is people have fixed, irrational, delusional ideas. And essentially that's creating abnormal proteins and incoherent water. And that's what we call being sick. And you can see that with something like Alzheimer's disease. They asked Mark Twain why he has such a good memory, and he said, because he never tells a lie. But if you live in a culture where everybody's lying more or less almost all the time, and then you make tangled webs in your water, and then you can't remember your wife's name. That's what we call Alzheimer's. So it's a physical manifestation. It's like a crystallization of a problem of consciousness, which is exactly what all the old medical systems said about life.
What role do genes play at all? I mean, what is DNA there for? What's its purpose?
DNA is an antenna that collects the energy, probably mostly from the sun, and actually creates, because of its folding structure, which is not a double helix, that was a mistake. You see, the whole structure of modern biology is you know, it's a fantasy basically. So, but this organized antenna actually creates this special water called pi water, phi water, out of which life is created. So the function of it is to be an energy, essentially antenna, probably for sunlight.
What about the phenomenon where, I look a lot like my dad, or, I got red hair, my mom had red hair. Do we pass traits down that way?
We pass traits, but that doesn't mean they're in the DNA. That's an interesting question, because it's the same question as people are often confused from what they experience, which is real, and an explanation which they have no idea. So if I was to say to you, okay, prove to me that your red hair is a function of one of the genes in your DNA, can you do that?
No, it would be totally based on what I've learned, what I've heard, and
even when you say what you've learned, so you have no idea how you would recreate that argument.
Other than to say, I was taught in school that, traits like that are passed down, from your parents through the genes.
So do you think anybody has identified a gene that gives you red hair?
If you would have asked me, a year ago, I would have said yes.
I don't think so. Now, it could be that there is a code that makes a certain protein, but even that I would submit is flexible, because you can also see that at a certain point in your life, your hair is redder than at other points, right?
Yeah.
So how is that, if it's just a gene cranking out protein for red hair, why is it variable over your life?
It's a great question.
No idea. So my point here is, the thing that you experience is, my mother had red hair, I have red hair. That's real. The thing you don't experience is that's because of a gene. That's a very abstract, and if you follow the steps, you would be very hard pressed to prove that.
Well, the reason I believe you is because this is so reminiscent of the virus phenomenon, where, based on my experience, I think I've been around people that had the flu or some other virus, and I got it, and everybody in my class got it in school. And so you assumed, that you were told that, it's contagious and it got passed around. And so that's what you believe.
Right. So, but if you deconstruct that, the thing that's an observation is, Joey got sick and then I got sick in a similar way. I'm not saying that observation is incorrect. Now, if I asked you, did you see the virus that Joey gave to you?
I would say no.
Do you think anybody has ever documented that there is a specific virus that could be isolated from Joey's tissues, his snot or lungs or skin, and that isolated virus was proven to cause those symptoms in another animal or human being?
Again, if you asked me a year ago, I would have said yes. Obviously, that's been proven, but now I know otherwise.
Right. And all I can say is, having spent like 100 hours looking for such a study, I can guarantee there is no such study in the medical literature. Therefore, you have no personal experience of the fact that the cause of this phenomena was a virus, right?
That's right.
You only know that there's something that seems like it may have been communicated from one person to another. Now, I would just, then the next step is I would be cautious of that for two reasons. One, that's called an epidemiological observation. And nobody in science says you prove causation with epidemiology. You only tells you what to study. The second thing is, if you think that because a lot of people in the same place get sick with the same symptoms, that proves it's a virus, then you must think that Hiroshima was a virus. Because a lot of people got sick in the same place and same symptoms, and I don't know anybody who thinks it was a virus. If you think it's, well, if something spreads from one place to another, that proves it's a virus. So you must think that Chernobyl was a virus because it started spreading all over Eastern Europe and people got the same symptoms. Or you must think that when sailors had their teeth fall out and then they went into heart failure and died on ships, they, for hundreds of years, they said there's something contagious that's being spread from one sailor to the next. And then they would dock and then the next ship would get it and they see it's being spread. Same with Berry, same with Pellagra, millions of people died. And then with the ship thing, somebody ate a lemon or a lime and the whole thing went away because it turns out they had scurvy. So that's the problem. Now, then if you say, well, the only thing that can pass between human beings, right, is a virus. So what about girls up to age 20 who go live in a cabin and they all start menstruating at the same time? Was that a virus? What about if somebody comes into the room who's happy and just exudes a kind of upbeat, and then next thing you know, people are feeling happier and more friendly. And we know that that happens. It even happens with yawns, right? Somebody yawns and then are those viruses?
It's so funny. I was just reading about this phenomenon because of you, because I noticed how yawning is contagious and I decided to look into it a little bit. And I can't, obviously, there's no good explanation out there that anybody can offer other than maybe you, but same phenomenon.
Right. So in fact, the only one that you can disprove is that there's no virus. Otherwise, it's very complicated to know what might have happened. Now, one of the reasons it's hard to talk about this is because in the last 150 years, nobody has looked into this, or practically nobody. So you can't say, well, here's a study that shows that it's an electromagnetic field resonance, or it's a, it's a this, or it's a sort of emotional connection, or it's a heart, energetic feeling. We just don't know, because we've narrowed ourselves into the only thing that's real are particles. And then ironically, we look for the particles and can't even find them, which is ironic because that's the whole theory of what this is about. And it turns out you can't even demonstrate the particles.
How about this phenomenon of just resonance as it pertains to illness? I've heard you talk about that it is possible that children that all get the chicken pox or whatever it is, measles, maybe there's an element of just resonance. Their cells vibrate at a certain frequency, which affect their brother or sister. They get sick. Is there something to that? Are things contagious in that manner?
So the thing is also, you can't discount shared toxins.
Of course.
You all go to the same restaurant and you get all sick because there's a toxin in the food. So that's not a
Your
contagion.
dirty air filter and some kind of
Right.
mold in the air. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. But if you dissect something like measles or chickenpox, so here's what we know for sure. One is these are childhood diseases that come and go through the millennia. In other words, in 1200 there was no such thing as measles or chickenpox, and then suddenly it appears, and then suddenly it goes away. And the old homeopaths used to call that genus epidemicus, that the epidemics had a kind of genius. So they're associated with a certain age or period in time. The second thing we know is that a child who goes through chickenpox or measles is better for life. They have fewer chronic diseases, they have better health, they have less cancer, less glioblastoma, less osteoarthritis, etc. So therefore, it's more like a maturation process than it is a disease. In fact, the whole classification or saying that's a disease is actually mistaken, because if you get poisoned, if you put in smoke in your lungs and then you cough it up, and so you have mucus and fever and all that, the mucus and fever is the therapy for smoking. Unfortunately, doctors don't know that, so they think that's the disease, and they make that stop, and then you end up getting sicker for life.
It's like when they stop your fever.
You're right. Or they stop you from eliminating the toxin. And in fact, that's really what disease is the resolution phase. So if that's true, in other words, this is a process that children should go through, and that if one understands it and they're reasonably well nourished, is completely harmless, then it's not so surprising that if one child does it, the other children might say, they might pick up something, especially if there's also maybe, there must be some age-related toxin, like for these 200 years, it's, lies or glyphosate or electromagnetic fields or something. So then essentially the children say, now it's time for us to go through this, and they do.
So in other words, these children in question in this example were maybe all exposed to the same toxin. One decides, one goes through this purging, this healthy process of ridding his body of the toxin. And then his classmates, his family members that are maybe roughly the same age, somehow pick up on that frequency, that resonance, and internally sort of decide to also go through the same process?
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, I don't know that for sure, because I don't have the research to prove it, because nobody has looked. But that exactly describes everything you see. It's a harmless maturation process, which essentially leaves people better for life. And then if you stop it through some artificial means, which is usually by poisoning them so that they're actually can't go through this maturation process, they will be sicker for life. They will be like misfits. Because what we're really talking about is this soul and spirit of the child is using fever and expelling toxic fluid to mold the physical body into being an instrument for its use. It's as if it's like a clay modeler molding clay into a perfect sculpture. Now you could say, well, you're going to get dirty when you mold clay, so don't do a sculpture. And fair enough, except then you'll never have any sculptures. And the problem is, if you stop a child from doing that, which is essentially what a vaccine is, they become, what the word that I use, they become misfits. Their physical body no longer can be a perfect instrument for their soul and their spirit. And we call being a misfit child with ADD or ADHD or depression or OCD, or they can't breathe right, or they have skin problems. They are literally misfits because somebody stopped them from maturing. And in some ways, there's no way to fix that, because you've you've messed up a natural process, which shouldn't have been messed up with.
Can you reverse it? I mean, obviously there are extreme cases of autism or worse, death in response to a vaccination. And then, I'm 44. I had vaccines as a kid. Was there irreversible damage in my case? I feel healthy. I think I'm healthy, but who knows?
I mean, right. All I can say, there's two sides to that. One, and I say this about you, and I say it about me and anybody else, you are probably not the person you could have been. I mean, it's probably not the only reason for that, but
there's many reasons for that. Believe me.
I have many reasons for that as well.
I'm sure.
That's just the fact. So we all just live with that. But that is I believe that every person who has those kind of toxins and metals injected into their body will never be the person they were meant to be.
So what's the difference in I'm exposed to some kind of nasty toxin in the air, mold or DDT or something, and I'm able to purge it through fever, through swelling and all that, versus I'm introduced to some of these nasty metals from a vaccine? Why can I purge myself of this environmental toxin, but not the toxin from the vaccine?
They're tougher. They get right into your tissues. And that's tough to get out.
Heavy metals.
Yeah, I mean, it's worse if you're mineral deficient, because then your body will hang on to them thinking we need something with a certain amount of valence, like 2+ charge. So they're a particularly difficult thing to detoxify.
Understood. Okay.
Partially because humans have probably very little history of injecting aluminum into your body. That's probably the main toxin. And interestingly, aluminum is almost absorbed like zero. You don't absorb aluminum orally or even through the skin. So that's number one. Number two, because we don't absorb it, we don't have any detoxification system for it, because why would you? You don't get it absorbed. And number three, there are no excretion pathways for aluminum, because why would there be? You don't get it absorbed, you don't detoxify it. Why would you waste your energy figuring out how to excrete it? And number four, there is no biological process known that uses aluminum as a cofactor, unlike iron and magnesium, molybdenum, etc. Because we don't absorb it, we don't use it, we don't detoxify it, we don't excrete it. So I have some advice for people. If you run across something like that, don't inject it into your body, because it doesn't belong there. And you may not know how to get rid of it, because you've got no experience biologically with getting rid of that stuff. And it ends up in your brain and all the rest of it.
On a quick side note, am I okay then putting aluminum deodorant, antiperspirant under my armpits if it's not absorbed into the skin?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I still wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Because there may be some absorption, but I actually ended up, when I really realized that, not that I use aluminum pots anyways, but that's probably actually not such a big deal, because it doesn't really get absorbed.
Right. But better safe than sorry.
Yeah. I mean, there's no reason to use it anyway. It makes a weird taste to your food. So.
Good point. Well, it seems like sort of the common thread in all the books of yours I've read and a lot of the interviews you've given is this phenomenon of structured water. And it seems like that is perhaps the most important thing that we can focus on and optimize to, keep ourselves healthy, to minimize risk of anything going around, virus or otherwise. So what are the
not virus?
Okay, what do we call it? Toxicity from
yeah, there's no virus going around. You got to purge that from your vocabulary.
My vernacular. Okay, I'll get rid of that. Well, I know that you've posited that it's possibly 5G And that I think, if I'm correct, that if you look at a map where 5G has been rolled out, it kind of corresponds to the prevalence of this COVID-19 prevalence. So,
I mean, the main thing to focus on, there's no evidence, there's no proof that there's any SARS-CoV-2 virus, and that should end the whole thing right there. And even if we do or don't know what else is maybe making some other people sick, is at this point not the issue. I mean, I don't think we should use wireless technology anyways, but right now we have to get that bit straight and go from there.
I agree. I've interviewed Stephanie Seneff, and she makes a very compelling argument that it could be glyphosate that is making people sick. Maybe it's 5G, but I guess my point is we do need to focus on optimizing our water, our structured water. And there's no doubt that electromagnetic frequencies, whether it be 5G, 4G, Bluetooth, or whatever, I imagine is going to affect the structure of that water. Am I right?
Yes, that is absolutely correct.
Things like being in the sun, grounding, walking around with your shoes off. What are the other sort of basic steps folks should take?
Clean water, drinking structured water, eating good food, has enough collagen and bone broth, all the things that humans have done for millennia.
And lastly, I'll ask you this. I know you talk a lot about how stress and emotion can affect your health. And I guess this water, the structured water, love versus stress. What's the mechanism there? How does holding hands with someone you love,
water, all these things are fields. They're resonant energy, and water is an energy field receiver. And so the experience of love versus the experience of hate and lies and fear is a completely different electromagnetic experience. And that is the basis of the structuring of the water. So if that's the way we're going to live, we're going to be a sick, demented culture, which is pretty much kind of where we're at.
Do you feel like emotions, stress, whatever it is, affect our water just as much as EMFs or some strong?
Yeah, everything does. I mean, we shouldn't narrow ourselves to it's just that or just this. We live in a complex world, and everything, thoughts, feelings, EMFs, dogs, trees are, electromagnetic emitters and receivers. And we need to be aware that this is the world we're living in.
I don't know if you've
reality, not this other nonsense.
I don't know if you've read much David R. Hawkins, and he has this map of consciousness, and they've done these studies where they'll test your strength when they play a certain type of music, for example, or if they hold up a GMO orange versus an organic orange, your body responds to those things. Do you think it could be things as simple as synthetic clothing and just being around things that are artificial or aren't natural? God knows what.
Absolutely. Should investigate everything in your life. If it's not here, but if it wasn't here 500 years ago, more or less, don't do it.
Sage advice. Well, I think that's a good place to end, Tom. I really sincerely appreciate your time. Where can I send folks that want to check out more of your work?
Yeah, drtomcowan.com. And we're asking everybody to subscribe to our Subscribe Star network, which gives you access to all kinds of stuff we're putting on, and to really join a community that's really working on this.
Like a lot of people that I follow, I think some of your content has been pulled down from various. Yeah. So this is a good option for sure. You also have the podcast, which at least at this point, they're not really censoring podcasts. So that's another good place to visit. All right, Tom.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Bless you. Take good care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Be well.